Welcome to the May 2021 Austin Software Cooperative Meetup. Today we're going to be doing a book review. We're continuing a book review that we started earlier in the year. You can check out the part 1 in January for The Democratic Worker-Owned Firm by David Ellerman. It's a pretty dense book, so we broke this down into parts. Watson's going to be going through a mind map he's created that dives into the book. You can feel free to jump in and ask any questions you have, and then we'll talk about what we can discuss next at the next meetings.
Thanks,
there you go, Watson.
Taylor. All right, so we went over the first chapter, the labor theory of property, and even the introduction and forward. It took us the whole hour. So now, after talking about the labor theory of property, which is kind of the reasoning, and it's kind of the rationale for trying to describe what a democratic worker-owned firm is and the foundations of that, and contrasting that with a typical, I'm going to say a capitalistic firm, but really he describes in the book that the word capital is overloaded. So it's really a firm that has an employer-employee relation versus one that does not. So that was in the labor theory of property, trying to tease those things out. Now, in chapter 2, we're going to get into democratic theory. So here we go. I highlighted some things here that I thought were important. If anyone else has read that wants to point anything out, let me know. Has anybody had a chance to look at the book and had any first impressions that they want to share before we get into it? All right, let's go ahead and get in. So we're gonna go over different descriptions of rights and principles in this chapter, and then we're going to talk about the employer-employee relation. I kind of moved this up to the top, even though it was in the middle of the chapter, because I think it's important to kind of understand. So inalienable rights, the right to, as it's applied to the fruits of labor. So here's like the rights to the positive and negative fruits of one's labor are inalienable rights. The argument was originally developed by radical abolitionists to critique voluntary self-sale contracts. It was the basis for anti-slavery doctrine of inalienable rights developed during the Enlightenment. The employment contract is a self-rental contract, a contract to sell a limited portion of one's labor as opposed to selling all of it. So it's kind of a radical critique of the relationship between employers and employees. It's basically saying that it's wage slavery. That's one of the radical things that he says in the book. But he's going to try to tease out why he thinks the selling of the fruits of one's labor is inalienable. That's was kind of teased out in the first chapter, but he's going to talk a little bit more about it here, and then how it applies to your way of working, the employer-employee relationship. So, and then also I wanted to point out, this is talking about voluntary self-sale contracts. So things like you could call indentured servitude kind of thing. The arguments were not just non-voluntary against non-voluntary slavery; it was against voluntary slavery, which is also illegal. So using those same principles, he tries to tease out that the employer-employee relationship is actually illegitimate. Does anybody have any questions so far? All right. Two principles to keep in mind: the democratic principle and the affected interests principle. The democratic principle of self-government is people have inalienable right to self-govern all of their human activities. When it's applied to worker-owned firms, it means you have direct control rights, which we're gonna talk about later what that is, over the direct control of rights over an organization should be assigned to the people who are governed by the organization so that they will be self-governing. So that's applying the democratic principle to corporations, places of work. The affected interest principle is everyone whose rightful interests are affected by an organization's decisions should have a right of indirect control, a collective or perhaps individual veto to constrain those decisions. Now, implementing that is kind of difficult, but he has a guideline later about how to do that. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about direct versus indirect. So the basic distinction between direct control rights and indirect control rights, it's going to be direct control rights are the rights to ultimately make decisions of the enterprise. Outside parties, such as suppliers or customers, have only indirect or negative decision-making constraining roles. Like basically, they can say, "No, I can't. I don't want to buy that." What I what he's doing here, what I think he's doing here, which is kind of what cooperatives try to do when people say that cooperatives are about community. It's kind of an implementation of trying to bring the larger community into the decision-making process. So you have the right to the fruits of your labor. So if you're making widgets, right? Let's go ahead and let's say you're making, I don't know, windmills. Okay. And let's say that the windmills and you're placing them out there. You have a community that may or may not want them right there. The community can say we want to say that they can have some type of control over the windmills, but they can't really tell you how to make windmills. So, and they don't have any authority to try to take or appropriate any of the profit from the windmill. So that's really what we're wrestling here with as far as direct control rights and affected interests and indirect control rights. I mean, that's what he's trying to tease out. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And let's see here. So generally, what he's trying to do is we're going to talk about, okay, I'll wait till we get down to this description of personal rights, but he's trying to tie direct control rights, like he's saying, to the people who are actually working in the firm. And then that's going to be an inalienable right. Whereas the indirect in some sense, because it's part of the affected interest principle, it's also an inalienable right, because we say that if you're affected by something, you should have input into the decision making process, but he limits it to veto. So, and then this is kind of a boundary for that with the just because you can make widgets, you can make windmills or nuclear facilities or whatever, that doesn't mean that you have the right to violate the rights of outsiders. So direct control rights are to be exercised within the constraints established by the indirect control rights of the external affected interests. This is kind of trying to solve the problem of externalities. Um, in the general idea is you can have typically people want to say that let the market decide. If people don't buy whatever it is that you're selling, then it'll disappear. But we know the idea, the concept of externalities, where if you're in one country and you pollute, but the wind blows all your pollution to another country, you don't care. It doesn't affect you, I should say, directly, but the other country gets affected. So that's an externality, and you have incentive to pollute given that you're making money, whatever it is that you're doing with these fossil fuels. So, how do you handle that? Well, having affected, using the principle of affected interests it kind of the pulls everything closer together to where the people that are affected, they have some way to vote. But you need to figure out some way to limit it, right? Because maybe they might vote on taking all the profit or something like that. So that's where the idea of what we see here, naturally within the market, a supplier can say, I don't want to buy your product. And that's what the normal control over a product would be, trying to pull that decision closer in into the enterprise for your users, for your suppliers, for your customers, for the people that are in the territory that you are inhabiting, these types of things. If they're affected, that's kind of the trick that's happening here. So it doesn't have to go, well, in this case, the market doesn't solve the problem at all. It's also the case that it could be that it solves it really slowly. So does anybody have any question so far?
Can we have maybe a more concrete example of the different type of parties? It could be something with, you're referring to the windmill. So I know that we have, I think last time we had the windmill maker. Someone could make a windmill and then someone else could use a windmill as a separate group, and they're making their own thing using windmill power. So that'd be one way if you want to continue on that, or you could relate it directly to like software development and stuff that we do. An example with the externalities, and then how you bring them in, and then limiting them. I'm interested in the limiting. I can inform decisions versus do they actually get a vote? Do they get a vote on what the?
Let's skip to it, man. Let's just go. What you're saying.
All right, or you can wait and hold.
Affected interest principle, veto to those only affected. Democratic principle, vote to those who are governed. That's the idea there. So to answer what you're saying, in software, let's say it's a standard for word processor, so documents, and XML standard. You have a bunch of consumers, so this is an API. You have a bunch of say producers, people who want to use the API, the document standard, and they want to create a document reader and editor. If one entity is, let's say that they have some type of market power where they were a first mover, and they are saying we're making a standard, we have a standard, but they keep changing it over and over, and other people, and it's tailored to their software. Everybody is basically, it's the tail that wags the dog. Everybody's doing a dance and they can never catch up. And maybe they even have, hidden features that aren't in the standard. These types of things. So it's a way to manipulate software. So you're affecting other people. You're affecting, in this example, you're affecting whole governments and everything, everybody that wants to use a document. And this is a real example. And, how is it that you are able to say who gets to, when you're developing the standard, who is it that gets to vote on it or discuss it or have any power over that standard? You have the people that are affected by it. It could be that now, if there are other people that are working on the standard, that would be kind of in the role of the direct control rights. Like, they're working on a thing, they kind of have the right to the fruits of their labor, so they get to have direct control rights over that. But what about the people who are going to consume that standard? So governments, right? That would be big consumers of it, but the general population too. But the big buyers, they're going to consume it, and they don't want to be pigeonholed. They don't want to be sucked into a situation where they have huge switching costs between one vendor and another. These types of things. What do they get to do? Well, they're an affected interest, but they're not part of it. They don't have any rights, fruits of labor, that type of thing. They would probably get some type of veto, kind of like people in the neighborhood when there's a nuclear facility getting built. They don't say, oh, well, here's how you build a nuclear facility, but they can say you may not have that in our neighborhood. So they can veto, and that's it's really a form of, it's kind of like, you can almost look at it as like an accelerated market power. This is the way you wouldn't buy a thing. You would say, well, even before you even put it out there, we're gonna say no, because we're affected. So there. Is that good enough?
Works for me. Does anyone else have questions or comments?
Good example.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a real one. We will leave the companies unnamed. All right, so let's see here. Is there any other questions? All right, here we go. Let's talk about personal rights. So this is part of the argument for trying to tease out why the employer-employee relation is illegitimate. It is this difference between personal and property rights. So a personal right is a right that attaches to an individual because the person satisfies some qualification, such as playing a certain functional role. An example would be basic human rights, where the qualification is that of being human. A person does not have to satisfy a role to hold a property right, however, and a property right can be acquired from a prior owner or it can be appropriated as an initial right. So basically, personal rights are not transferable, right? This is the test. They can't be transferred, right? So you can't inherit them, these types of things. Property rights can be passed on to a person's estate and heirs, right? Those are the different things, right? Different types of rights. He's going to say, or he says that personal rights, the right to the fruit of your labor is a personal right. It can't, even if you want to consent the same way that you cannot consent to being to going into indentured servitude, it would be illegal, even though you consent. It's because it's a personal right. Right. So it cannot be transferred. You cannot transfer your autonomy to someone else. That he's saying that you cannot do that for your work. It's illegitimate. So you can't sell all your time to someone else. You can't sell even hours of your time to someone else. That's what he's teasing out here. So he's saying personal versus property. Or any questions on that? All right, so here we'll read this out. So the employment contract denies workers the right to the positive and negative. That's something to remember. Whenever you are defending or talking about cooperatives, worker owned anything, people immediately, the first knee jerk reaction is the workers or the people are trying to basically get something for nothing. They don't want to assume the risk. They didn't take the risks, but they want to take all of the profit and all of this so on and so forth. No, it's you have the right to the positive and negative fruits of the labor. So both of them come. So if you got into some risk and you failed, that's also yours, right? So this argument goes for the whole thing. So in any case, the employment contract denies workers the right to the positive and negative fruits of their labor. Yet people's right to the fruits of their labor has always been the natural basis for private property appropriation. Thus, capitalist productions, far from being founded on private property, denies the natural basis for private property. So interesting argument. And he starts talking about Hobbes and some other philosophers and Enlightenment philosophers. Basically, the whole idea of contracts and the social contract and state of nature and these and so on and so forth. There's really two reasons or two ways to think about governance and governments, constitutional governments. And he has it right here. There are two opposite types of voluntary contract or constitutions that form constitutional governance. The Hobbesian constitution, wherein the rights of governance are alienated and transferred to the ruler, that's the first type. And number two, the democratic constitution, where inalienable rights of governance are merely delegated or entrusted to the governors on behalf of the governed. Right. So let's see here. Basically, he's saying that we don't really do the Hobbesian form anymore. We do basically any of the other forms of which is basically the democratic form of contract now. But and I'm forgetting where I have that. but that's that. I think it's in the next chapter down there. So is there any questions on this chapter? All right, let's go. All right, so now we were talking about democracy in general. Now we're going to apply it to the democratic firm, or two firms in general, so we can get a democratic firm. All right, so now this is probably one of the most important things in both of these chapters is this contrasting between these two principles. The affected interest principle is the veto to those only affected, merely affected, not governed, but they're affected. They can have veto. And that's that. I would almost want to say that that's the community principle. The democratic principle is a vote to those who are governed. All right, so we just kind of reviewed democratic firm is based on two fundamental principles: the democratic principle, people's inalienable right to self-govern, and the labor theory of property, people's inalienable right to appropriate the positive and negative fruits of their labor, right? Which is, like we said, a personal right. So the democratic principle, you're going to take the direct control rights and give it to the governed. And you're not going to assign them to external parties, obviously. Okay, so in this chapter, there are things that you might come up with trying to reason about how you would really make a democratic firm. There's some certain intuitions, and then he goes a little bit further. So I found it to be very useful. And he draws on cooperatives that have been around forever and what they actually do. One of the things that you might come up with or think about with cooperatives, like how do you handle investment? How do you handle the initial startup costs, so on and so forth? How do you handle people that might contribute more than the other person? So it's really the problem of within the fair division jargon, it's the problem of egalitarianism and equitability. So everything all exactly the same versus things being divisioned out based off of whatever it is that you want: effort, risk, these, so on and so forth. So he comes down on the side of equitability. So the value of the net assets should remain a property right, recoupable in part by the current and past members who invested and reinvested their property to build up those net assets. So what's the net asset? If there are members who are part of we have an example down here that'll be a little bit better. This would be something that would be describing an asset. So instead of retaining the earnings to finance a machine, yes, nope, let's talk this way. This one here. Yeah, in a democratic firm, the past workers, so workers who were in history in the firm, in theory, could have used their control and print rights to pay out all the net earning instead of retaining any in the firm. Right? They could have just said, let's zero everything out, everybody gets paid. Suppose they retained some earning to finance a machine. Why should those workers lose their claim on that value, except as they use up the machine? Why should the fruits of their labor suddenly become social property simply because they choose to reinvest it in their company? This is something that people come up with as far as when they think of everything is shared or some kind of thing. They think that, oh, how do you handle basically investments and things like that where one person puts in more than another or whatever initiatives that a subgroup may have or one person may have? How do you deal with it? Right. And so some people may think, oh, is it supposed to become social property so that everyone owns it? So basically, the long story short, there's this thing called internal capital accounts, right? And that's the way to try to make this equitable. So instead of retaining the earnings to finance a machine, suppose the workers paid out the earnings as bonuses, deposited them all in one savings bank, and then took out a loan from the bank to finance the machine using the deposits as collateral. That's the first part, because you could actually just do that. And then that would be how you would be financing investments and stuff like that. And then, but you have a claim on the what was deposited, right? So the people who don't have a claim on what's deposited, they didn't put any money, they don't have a claim on it. So it just works, just right out of the back. But next step, if we simply leave the bank out, the capital balance represented in the savings account is essentially loan capital. Such accounts are called internal capital accounts. Basically, you put everything that someone invests internally in the company, you put it into an account. And it's credited to them. That's an internal capital account. And then you can borrow against it. You can do many things against it. Right. So there's accounting names for this type of thing, but that's basically the general idea. One of the concepts is.
Can you go over that,
Go
the right above where it's saying that, yeah, that one, internal capital accounts represent internal debt owed to the members as opposed to external debt.
Right. So
we're talking about ownership and stuff, and do you lose ownership and everything else? So does this, I'm trying to see where this shows, whether it goes to community ownership or how that represents. It looks like it's partly there.
So there's internal capital accounts, which is basically has your name on it. So you have an account somewhere in a ledger that says, Taylor put in 10,000 in here, and the company can borrow against it, do whatever, but you put it in there, right? And then the company owes you that money, so it's a debt to you. Right? An external debt is a debt owed to the bank or to if the company borrowed from anyone, so the bank or whatever. So if we did originally put the money into the bank, we owe money to the bank, right? But they have collateral, which is your money, but you still owe. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right.
And then I guess this comes into the different, is there something said about the difference on if you're working on a widget and let's say everyone is equally working on a widget, and then you have profit come in, and then whatever the outside of whatever you're working on an hourly rate or whatever, and then you have additional profit from selling the widget, and then that can be distributed to the people equitably. How does that tie into stuff like this, though? So not work that created a widget, but instead investment.
That's basically, yeah. So that's what this example here they're saying, right? In theory, they could have used their control rights to pay out all the net earnings. That's a net earning is what you're saying, instead of retaining any in the firm. So you can pay everything out or you can retain some. right? So retaining them would be, oh, we're trying to do something, invest or what have you. Right? So that's the two things. So people could decide to invest or not. And so individuals, so there's two, and then we getting into this, but there's two sides, and I think this is what you're asking. There is mandatory, and then there is individual voluntary. So mandatory would be something like this. Let's see. Is this it? Yeah, no, right here. So when you put money into the capital account, you could have a rule that when you join the worker owned, either it gets taken out. It could be a fixed initial fee that could be paid from the payroll, so it gets taken out, for first couple months or whatever, or it can be an initial fee just right out of the pocket. So a joining fee, right? So then you'll have an initial balance in each member's internal account to cover their share of losses. So that's what this is about. It's really about insurance and managing debts and losses and things like that. But that's an example of a mandatory one, like an involuntary one. The voluntary one would be me, you, and one other, but not, if there's 10 of us, not the rest. We decide to buy a machine. That would be this example here, where we're saying we got together and financed the machine. Does the machine become social property immediately? No. Your internal account is not social property. Internal capital account is not social property. Like, the company owes you that money. So this is
So then,
go ahead.
what if, okay, so just kind of working this out. So now let's say that's a $25,000 machine, and you have 3 out of 10 people that invest to do that. And then this machine, so now there's on the accounts, the money borrowed to buy the machine for the company is owed back to those 3 people. So that has to be paid. And then what about the machine is now used, and let's say it's bringing profit to the company. And so how does that relate to the money owed to buy the machine, and then any profit that the machine brings in to the company?
When the company, remember, so he talks about this in the first chapter. So you can loan equipment. You can think of it as you leased some trucks to do work in a quarry. The people that created the trucks and that own the trucks, they don't get to do anything with the money that, if you go and sell the rocks from the quarry, that gravel, if you go and sell it, they don't get to have anything to do with what you produced with their trucks. You only owe them the rent for the trucks. When you put money into that capital account, the company now says, well, now it wants to buy some machines or lease some machines or whatever, right? So you don't get to say anything about that profit, right? The company does that. Now there's the thing of where, if there was only 3 of you working on whatever it is that's using that machine and the other people, then that just goes to your own hours and rates and stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Sure. So without regards to trying to figure out what this machine is, if we say it's now purchased, or maybe all the parts and all the people worked on it and built it out, the whole company, and now it's making money. So the money and the machine itself, if it's, I guess, borrowed, the company that has the intent of owning, and the profit it brings in is for the whole company. But the three people that invested, they don't get to decide, well, we invested, so you need to give us some of the profit that you're getting by using the machine. They're only can say, you owe us, whatever, maybe
You're getting
interest or
paid by the
direct or
interest.
whatever.
Yeah, you're
That's
only
it.
getting paid that.
And then this is, I know that we went over this some in part one, but just kind of circling it all back. Now they say, and I think this was maybe at the start of the this part meeting too. They say, well, I don't want just interest. I want, as far as my investment, to receive profit on whatever you use it for.
Mm-hmm.
So they could make that contract and someone could sign it. That would be the same. Would that be the same as like the indentured servitude? So are we just talking like morally we think it's wrong or what? Because if I said I'm going to invest, but go ahead.
Yeah, I believe he talked about, I want to say he talked about if you were able to patent something, like some kind of process or something like that, it would make you're owning that. In that sense, you could be making sense there. But I think there's some boundary where, like you said, there's consent and the limits of consent. If you're taking away from someone's, they're the ones borrowing from you. And that's where I think the limit is. Like the only thing you can do is have them borrow your money from you, and then they do what they want from it. And when I say they, it's really the company in general. You're also voting on whatever you do with this equipment.
So let's make it maybe tie it back to the Morrison thing on affected interest. So now you have three people that they invested to buy the machine, and now the company's using it to make profit. There's different ways that they could do it. So there's a vested interest in getting paid off on the machine. If we don't just think they're making money on interest, at some point you want to go, I don't want you to go under. So would there be the people that invested in the machine have votes beyond what they would have as also workers? Since we're talking about the same set of people, these three people,
I don't think so.
they may also be voting on, here's how we're going to use the machine to make profits, and they're doing that. So as a group, we're already doing that. But then because they invested, what if they think you have a bad idea?
It's only a loan. Like I use the word invest, but you're just letting them borrow the money from you. So, I mean,
So
it's
this
really
makes
that.
me, I guess what I'm thinking of in the back, just to kind of bring this forward, is when you have a company and you have a group of investors come in and they want to be on a board or whatever and make decisions and say, nope, we don't want you to do that.
Nope, there's none of that
sort of thing.
This whole thing, he basically the one way that he uses the word lean. So when you put money into the capital internal account, right? So the company owes you money, right? But if there are losses in the company, that's part of the agreement. The company puts a lien on your internal account. It's using that internal account, everybody's internal account, to cover its losses. So it says, no, you can't have the money back, right? You don't put liens on the company. Like you have an agreement with them when you let them borrow money. But I don't think you can say oh, your labor, 10% of that also comes to me. He doesn't provide for that in here. He does have some very interesting let's see, and I don't have them in here. He does have some very interesting, some creative things where he talked about bonds. So what happens is you put out a bond and say that the bond is related to the profit of the company. So it pays out interest only when there's a profit, and then anyone can purchase it. So it'd be the same as, having publicly available stocks, that kind of thing. And it works the same way. So you can have investors that are there, but it's the same thing as you don't get to say, it would be just like you buying, a little bit of stock in Google, and you don't get to tell Google what to do. They're just like, no, if it goes up in value, then you made some money. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Too bad. And that's what this whole relationship is like too. So, any other questions? There's one more thing I wanted to talk about. So, this one here, there's two more. So, as far as the whole idea of having an internal, just by default, having an internal capital account, he seems to think that it creates an incentive for the members to think long term, right? And so, how the question arises, like, when do you pay this thing out? And his whole thing is, you should not have it to where, what you might think intuitively, to where, oh, when someone leaves the company, it pays them out, over a certain amount of time, or when they retire, it pays them out. That's not really just it. It should have a limit as far as how long it can go. So let's say 5 years, and it should automatically start paying out, just so that everybody, because when you have let's just say a 5-year internal capital account, that's your risk. That represents your risk in the company, like the company can have loss and whatever. And that's the thing you're supposed to be sharing with everyone else. So you really are trying to get it all to be the same amount. So the people you don't want to incentivize the people who have been with the company for a long time to retire, because that's what will happen if you only let them get it when they leave. So you're incentivizing the wrong thing, but you're also making it to where they hold all the risk. You really want to start trying to share the risk. Is the whole idea of these capital accounts, is also covering your losses. And then when you have that there, it creates the incentive for older and younger workers, as far as age with the company, to both be thinking long term, because you don't want to lose your capital account. Like, you want the company to be profitable. So that's where the rationale is behind having that. And the time limit thing is called a rollover capital account. So it would just be paying out every 5 years. It would keep a limit on how long that account would be, the extent of how much money it would have in it. So, any questions? All right.
Thanks, Watson.
Yeah, no problem.